Really happy to have him here and presenting for us. So with that, I'll let Kent take over.
Thank you, Josh. Well, this afternoon, as I go through my presentation, the key thing I wanted to point out is if any of you have comments or questions as we go, I've got plenty of time in the slot allocated to answer questions, so feel free to interrupt me and ask questions as we go along. As Josh said, I've worked for Kansas Farm Management through the K-State Extension Program for 32 years and just retired on December 31st. And I'm a CPA. My degree was in Ag Econ with an accounting double major from Oklahoma State. And I worked for KPMG, or you can tell how old I am because back then instead of KPMG, it was Peat Marwick, one of the international accounting firms for 3 years before I started work for the Kansas Farm Management Program. So that's kind of my background. I've worked with about 135 farms through that 32 years with the Farm Management Program, and so I really enjoy dealing with transition and estate planning type issues and that type of thing in particular. My contact information is here and it's on the copy of the slides. If you have any questions there, you can get a hold of me with this information. Today what I'd like to do is to get down more of the nuts and bolts of transition planning and succession planning, and maybe look at some specific examples and scenarios that would facilitate succession planning, and maybe just maybe an idea might pop into your head, well maybe something like this might work in your situation. So that's kind of my goal today, and then to review some example agreements that might be appropriate in each one of your cases.
Can you back that slide up one?
Sure. And this is on the in the notebook. This is I've got a copy of the PowerPoint slides in the notebook, so this would be in the notebook too if you need it. What we see a lot of times in agriculture is there's kind of this do nothing scenario, and what they do is look at, you have another generation wanting to come into the farm. Well, instead of taking any legal action, it's basically just do nothing currently, but then the older generation may promise to leave something on the farm to the younger generation. And so the key thing, I guess my frustration a lot of times when working with farmers is, even though it's a family situation, you wouldn't bring an employee in and offer him not have something in writing that's going to dictate what's going to happen on down the road. And I think you want to be sure and always treat your family members just like you would an outside employee that you're considering bringing into the operation. And so what we also see then is a lot of the informal enterprise transfers, like you might say, well, son's coming back to the farm, we're going to let one of the neighbors just offered us to let him farm his 160 acres, we'll put that farm over in the son's name, and or you might say, well, we've rented another pasture, let's just put these 30 acres or 30 cows over into the son's name. Well, the problem with that is that works out fine as a way of getting your feet on the ground, but it's really hard then to measure what should really the profitability split between dad and son, what should that really be, and it's hard to really put a measure on if the son's using equipment on that 160 acres he's farming, what is really that value that is being transferred over from the dad to the son. And so that's one of the negative sides of doing this. The problem is that, you don't have any written plan at all, so your son is relying on the fact, well, is dad really going to take care of me in the estate plan? So you can, he's relying on dad to be around and to be sure that he's got his trust set up right to where he's gonna take care of the on-farm heir. There's no calculation device in place to determine who owns what equity. Again, I think the new generation of these people coming back to the farm that are in that 20 to 35 age group, they're much more, I think they're much more cognizant of they're wanting a piece of the action or a piece of the profits earlier in life, and most of them aren't planning on sticking around and farming until they're 80 years old. I think a lot of the younger generation is looking to say retire at more of a normal age, and so they're looking to try to build their net worth at a quicker level. And so I think, to me, the key thing, advantage of having a written plan in place is you let them, if they're contributing half of the management, you ought to try to figure out some way that you're getting half of the net worth increase going over to that next generation, that you're not leaving them hanging forever and ever. Because number one, I think a lot of the kids these days, would abandon you in a hurry if they see that they're not building any net worth at all. And it's just good for the overall business operation if they can see that they're going to be gaining net worth as they go along. Again, the negative side of it is there's no guarantee that dad's going to take care of him. A lot of times what might happen is, dad and mom set up a trust plan, and then, who's going to who do you think is going to live longer in most situations, dad or mom, if they're the same age? Well, it's probably going to be mom. Men's life expectancy isn't near as high as women's. And so what I've seen happen a lot of times is that mom starts getting pressure from the off-farm heirs, even if there has been a specific bequest left in their trust, she gets a lot of pressure of trying to keep family harmony and saying, well, even though dad intended on maybe the farm equipment to go to the son, I'm gonna divide it evenly. And again, as we talked about, fair and equitable may not be equal. So and that is the situation too, is even if you're doing specific bequests, that tends to create conflict in the family, because how do you really know if you're giving the on-farm heir $500,000, was that really what he contributed through the years? Was that, should that have been only $250,000, or should it have been $1 million? There's really no way of knowing that. And so if you've got a written plan in place throughout the years, you can come a lot closer to approximating what that number should be. So this is kind of Kent's rules of successful business planning. Is to me, it's really crucial that you want before you set up any type of an entity or any type of a business relationship, you want to make sure that the younger generation is going to work out. You may have a new daughter-in-law coming into the operation that may be a city girl that doesn't know what it's like to live in Winfield, Kansas, or Girard, Kansas, and so you want to make sure that those scenarios are going to work out before you get into a complicated entity. These entities that Roger talked a lot about this morning, they're fairly easy to get into from a tax standpoint, but they're a real bear to get back out of. So you don't want to get into a situation where you bring son in, you set up some big entity, and then within a year he's saying, well, this isn't working out. I don't like farming, or my wife doesn't like living on the farm. I want out, and then you have to go through a lot of time trying to unwind the agreement. So that's one of the rules I like to see. Just go ahead and hire the son. Pay him a reasonable wage for 3 or 4 years until you see that everything is going to work out between all the families involved. The second thing I think is really key is that you really need a cash flow plan in place that's going to guarantee, are you really generating enough cash flow on the farm to really support 2 families? And I say that we've come through these 8 years of just unprecedented record high net incomes, and everything is great on the farm now, but the cash flow projections for 15 don't look very good with average crop yields. Things are going to get a lot tighter, I think, than most people realize. And so the worst thing in the world to me you can do is encourage your son to come back into the operation, and then within a year or two you can't even make, you're having trouble making the payroll or guaranteed payments. You want to make sure you've got your cash flow plan in place, that that you're comfortable that you've got the means to bring the next generation in. I was at a Cowley County Livestock Association meeting here a couple years ago, where there was a rancher from Texas, evidently a really big ranch in Texas, and his point in terms of succession planning in their operation is, he says, well, their rule in their family is, in order to come back into the ranch, the children have to bring their own new business enterprise in, and they have to be able to give a cash flow to show how what they're going to contribute into the operation. And I know that may be a little bit of a harsh thing, in a lot of this area, you may not be looking at doing that, but I think he had a point, is that you want to really be able to show what's the new generation going to contribute to the farm. And these days, with all the new technology and GPS things, I know a lot of farms I've worked with, it's been those younger generations that have kept the you know, the auto steer and all the fancy technology, or I shouldn't even call it fancy anymore. It's what you're dealing with, and a lot of times you know, those younger generation guys know what they're doing and are almost a necessity just to be able to operate some of the equipment. So that might be an example of what they can contribute into the operation. But then the third rule that I have is you really need a written and a written fair transition plan in place. You don't want these verbal agreements that says, well, that Dad says, well, I'm sure going to take care of you. Don't worry about it. You want to be sure that you've got everything in writing and that everything is a fair agreement. So the key goal would be to establish those business entities and formal legal agreements to facilitate the transfer of the management and to share the profits to the next generation. You know, the younger generation, they want to feel like they're a part of management. They don't want to just be a hired man, and they want to see right away that I'm contributing 50% to this operation. You want to figure out a way to get them 50% of the profits, but but you also have to do that in a fair and equitable way. The one thing before I kind of skip by this is we were looking at as far as no written plan problems. I might give you another scenario that I was a friend of mine from Oklahoma State is a CPA down in southern Oklahoma, and this is an example of what bad can happen with no documentation. But if I remember the story, and I'm paraphrasing this a little bit, but there was a father who was single. His wife had passed away, but he owned about 3,000 acres and was getting up into his upper 50s and early 60s and was having a few health issues. Well, he talked his son into coming back into the operation, and the dad owned about 3,000 acres of farm ground, and they set up a partnership. So they had a formal partnership agreement, and but the partnership never paid any rent to the dad for this 3,000 acres of land they were using. And so it went along, they were just dividing the profits 50-50 between the son who had come in and the dad. Well, what happened then, Dad passed away, and it was back, it would have been like in the early 2000s. I believe that the estate tax rate, or the estate tax exemption at that time was around $2 million. Well, the dad had a taxable estate, so he had to file all the inheritance tax returns. Well, the IRS came in and looked at that, and they basically said, well, the partnership was not paying Dad rent on this land, and so they put a payable into the dad's inheritance tax return and said, well, over these years there was another $500,000 of rent that should have been paid to the dad that never was, and so they made them add that $500,000 for inheritance tax, or were trying to make them add that. Well, then what happened is that the dad had left the farming partnership with the cattle and farm equipment to the son. Well, then the two sisters who were off farm, of course, got wind of what was going on. Well, they jumped in and in civil court sued the brother who was the administrator of the dad's estate, saying, well, we agree with the IRS. You should have been, Dad should have been paid this $500,000 through the years. And so you had the IRS and the off-farm heirs fighting this on-farm heir. Well, what had really happened in their true agreement was that, well, Dad was kicking in the use of the land, but Dad was really not able to physically do much labor. Well, if they had just set up their operating agreement to say, well, we're paying the $80,000 a year in the rent of the farm ground to the dad, and then paid son $80,000 for the labor that he was contributing in, then this wouldn't have been an issue at all. And fortunately, they were able to get all this settled in court when the IRS appeals, and they finally got it to where the IRS agreed, well, yes, the son was contributing enough labor to offset the land contribution that Dad was making. But they could have avoided all this if they had just had a good partnership agreement and spelled all that out. So that's an example of what can happen when you don't have any written plans.